Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're gonna be painting over another one of my red ballpoint pen sketches. And for this time I wanted to make it a little bit more informative and talk a little bit about how I mixed my skin tones, and especially for this lighting, so it's gonna be a little bit of demonstration. And for this edition of the series, we're gonna be painting Yennefer from The Witcher. I've been trying to draw her for a while and I finally found the perfect reference photo for it, so it's really exciting. As always, this is what won the poll from my last video, and if there's something you want to see me paint for my next video, make sure to leave your suggestions in the comments, or like the ones that are already in there, I will be doing the most upvoted comments for the next one. So going back to this one, there were a couple of reference photos that I already sketched, but I decided to abandon them when I saw this one because I also wanted to do a demo for how I mixed skin tones in this lighting and explain how I mix the colors that I'm gonna use for it in detail. So the key for me in painting scenes that I'm not used to is to always limit the colors entirely. So for this one, it's by only pouring out the colors that I'll need, so it forces me to only work with those colors. So for this piece, most of our skin tones is going to be using these 4 colors, and the first one is silver gray instead of white because I don't want my colors to be too light, so I want this to be the brightest color on her face. And the second one is burnt sienna, which is a good solid skin tone base, but for this we're going to use it as a tinting color because in this lighting it's mostly all just going to be different hues and shades of gray. The next one that we'll need is a good ivory black. This one is dark but it's also very warm, and it's great for making sure that the values are anchored to be very dark in the piece. And so the last one that I'm using is indigo, which is also a dark color, but it's actually a very cool blue, so I'm going to use this in contrast to the ivory black. I do later on add a little bit of carmine to my palette, but only as a tinting color, and I will be telling you guys when I use that too. So to get us all started, I like to start with the eyes, and for that I'm going to start by mixing my black with my gray, and I'm only using my indigo very sparingly. It's almost like watercolor, the consistency that I'm using it, and I just use just enough to get the colors that I need to lean cool enough to look like the photo, and I'm going to use that to paint in the cooler parts of her eyes. But then if I need a darker color to line my irises, I would just go back and add more ivory black. So the great thing really is because we only have these colors, we are really forced to not complicate the mixtures. So whenever I would need a warmer color, since I only have burnt sienna that is closest to the colors that I have, I would just add that for the warmer parts of her irises. And so since we're using the same colors for the whites of her eyes, I'm just starting with my gray again and adding a little bit of burnt sienna to it, so it's a little bit warmer on this side. And then when I want to make it slightly cooler, I would just slowly incorporate the indigo back to the mixture. So there's always just very little shifts in the colors, but you can really see their differences and how they contrast each other. As soon as they're beside each other, you can really see those differences very clearly. And so for the warmer, darker parts of her irises, I would also just slowly add in my ivory black and my burnt sienna to the same ones that I used before. So I think that was pretty simple, but when we start mixing in the skin tones, it's actually just a very similar process. As you can see, the color that I'm using right now is just ivory black and burnt sienna. I'm using that to line her eyes, but really this is already her skin tones. That's where we're starting. The rest of the skin tones is a very similar process. My base color is just the gray and the burnt sienna. And I will be slowly adding in the indigo to neutralize that too warm color until it's the color that I want. And then to get it to be lighter, I would just add in more of the silver gray in the mixture. So it's really not that complicated. I think that the biggest challenge actually is not how to mix these colors, but to recognize what colors you need to paint with. And so you see for her eye bags, I've slowly started to add in the carmine, but very sparingly. I'm trying to remember not to use it that much. I only needed to add more of a pink hue to my base skin tone, which is the colors that I already have. So right there, that's ivory black instead of the indigo with my gray and burnt sienna. So it's not as green, because the indigo would make it lean too green. Using the black would just give you a very similar but more neutralized color. And you can see right here, to get the darkest, cooler shadows, I would mix in my indigo with my black. And then as we move further out from those darker shadows and get it to be lighter, we just slowly add in more of our silver gray. So it's really a very similar process throughout this whole thing. And like I said before, it's less about how you mix your colors, but the challenge really is to recognize which colors you have to mix. And this is something that I had a lot of trouble with. What really helped me was starting digital art, because it really helps you isolate the colors and make you see the colors for what they are and not how they should be. So as you can see right here, my skin tone mixes have already started to look very gray, and that is because of the lighting. A lot of this is just trusting the process and making sure you're isolating the colors on the picture and not just going off of your preconceptions of what skin is supposed to look like. Because if I had that in mind while I was mixing her skin tones, I would have been too nervous to try these colors, because on their own they look very gray. But when you slowly start to add in a little bit of burnt sienna or a little bit more of the carmine in your mixture, can really see how much those colors are gonna shift a certain way. And also with how you mix in, especially the background, and how you mix the colors in the background is really gonna put everything else into perspective. And it would also just make your brain fill in the gaps and make you recognize these very gray colors as actual skin tone. So isolating the colors is not an easy thing to learn, and it took me a long time to finally get it. But a big tip that I can tell you guys to do is to get a digital color picker and try to move the colors that you're trying to replicate onto a plain white background. And you can see right here, this is what the colors would look like if I just put them on a plain background. On their own, they look very gray and dark. It almost looks wrong. But as we know, it's just all relative. When we have all of these darker elements in the rest of the photo together, those are what really fills in the gap in our brains and make it look like they belong. So as you can see, even when I'm mixing the colors for her lips, this was the biggest challenge, is that I tried not to add too much of the red and the burnt sienna to it, because not only does she have a more natural lip color in the reference photo, I also don't want it to stand out too much from the rest of the lighting. So it was one of the harder times for me to really tell myself to trust in the process and just paint it the way I see it, because her lips are mostly just gray in the painting. There are tinges of red and yellow, but they are only tinting a little bit of the lips, and most of it is just painted in a very similar way that I painted the colors for around her eyes. So I hope I explained how I mix the skin tones well in this video, and I also tried to get as much of it in camera as I can. But because of how long this process actually took for me to make, what I'm gonna do now is to finish the rest of the video in a way that I do my other videos and just talk more about the process in general. Tell me if you guys like more informative voiceovers like this. I feel like I haven't been doing them as much lately, but I will bring them back if you guys like them. So that really is how I mixed my skin tones, really work with a base. And for this, it was the burnt sienna and the silver gray. And then once I figured that out, I was just slowly tint them with different colors to just nudge them in the right direction as I paint the rest of the painting in sections. So I hope I explained that part really well. I also had a little bit of problem with her forehead, and that's just because I was really struggling with only getting the silver gray as the brightest point in her face. I do think that I cheated and added a little bit of white to some parts of the highlights on her nose, but for most of the piece, the brightest parts of her face was really just the silver gray. And yeah, it was just a matter of trusting that that was the lighting that I was working with and just mixing the colors accordingly. I think the most enjoyable part of the piece was finally getting to use the ivory black by itself. So it was really satisfying because it finally grounded the rest of the colors in the proper values, because I'm finally painting in the darkest parts of the painting. I think it really made the skin tones make more sense. But yeah, her hair was so satisfying to make. For the brightest highlights, I actually used a bit of gray for it, but also the grays, I've tinted them with a little bit of the indigo, so they lean very cool. And so it would make the cool grayish colors in her skin tones look more natural, and it just really cements the lighting for the piece and tells you why the colors have shifted in that way. And I just think it's so satisfying to watch. And even though I've talked about how I paint the skin tones, there's also still, in my skill level, the element of luck when I paint, especially for larger areas of the face, like her jaw and the rest of her cheek right here, since there are bigger sections of the face that I have to paint, and so there are more transition colors I need to do. I do still think that I got lucky with the rest of her face, because aside from recognizing the colors you need to mix and also mixing them, there's also a different element to gouache in that it dries at different values, so it could look dark enough in your palette, and when it dries on your paper, it would look lighter. So there's also that element still with gouache that makes it a bit more of a challenge. But I still really enjoy it, and it's becoming my favorite medium over watercolors. It's very satisfying to paint with gouache. I also just really like rewatching the clips in my videos when I'm editing, and you can really see how much they cover my pen sketches, which are very intense and very vibrant by themselves. I just don't get the same amount of coverage with other mediums, and even with acrylic gouache, I just think those two perform very differently. There's just nothing quite like gouache in paint form. I've noticed recently that oil pastels feel very similar to gouache, but in their application, they're still very different mediums, and that's just what makes gouache so special. The rest of the piece was a joy to paint, just because I've already set the tone for how dark I wanted the skin tones to be, and already having an idea of how I want the background to complement it. It was just so nice to see everything finally come together. And I think we can even see that her skin tones have looked very light now that everything else is very dark, and that's just how colors affect each other relatively when they're next to each other, and especially in values. I think that's so awesome to watch. And just this whole thing was so enjoyable to make. I actually finished this a while ago, but there are more videos that I'm filming in bulk so that I can take a few days off to spend time with my family. But I still remember how much I enjoyed this one. I thought this was going to be harder than how it actually was, so that is always a bonus. I think the little details were so fun to paint, like her necklace and the stitching on her dress. Those details were so fun to add. And the stitching especially, it's because for it, I've used the burnt sienna, which I didn't use much for the rest of the piece except for her face. So it's really nice to finally bring that color back into another part of the painting. I also used my metallic gray for it, so it adds this shining moment in the painting when you turn it around and it hits the light right. But yeah, that is it for this one. I really loved painting this, and I also hope that little demo in the first part is helpful to you guys, and if it isn't, leave a comment and tell me how I could improve it. But yeah, that is it for this one. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you to my patrons for supporting me, and I will be seeing you guys again soon.